Hey there! Tonight we're not heading to the courts of kings or the bloodied fields of battle. We're walking barefoot through muddy furrows past the bramble fences of long-forgotten fields and into the quiet wisdom of the medieval farmer. The kind who rose before the birds. The kind who worked land they didn't own, in a world that barely noticed they existed. And yet, somehow, these farmers knew what we've forgotten. How to feed a body so it wouldn't break, how to draw strength from the simplest roots, how to outlast famine, frost and fatigue with nothing but patience, cleverness and a handful of forgotten superfoods. Not the kind you'll find powdered and overpriced in a wellness store. No branding, no trends, just quiet survival, grown from soil and necessity. If this kind of slow, grounded history helps you relax, helps you fall asleep, or just gives you something peaceful to sink into, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to know who else is out there, sharing the same calm rhythm of curiosity. So pull your blanket a little tighter, settle in, let the hum of the past surround you like mist over the fields. Because tonight, we're digging up 15 forgotten treasures, and the first one might still be growing somewhere in your backyard. The humble nettle, sting first, heal later. You've stepped off the path now, haven't you? Not far, just into the margin of the woods where the brambles grow thick and the air smells sharp with sap and damp earth. There, brushing against your leg, a patch of nettles. Vicious little things, aren't they? Your skin itches just from looking at them. Fine green leaves with tiny spines that sting like fire. No one touches them on purpose unless they know better. But medieval farmers, they knew better. To them, nettles weren't weeds, they were food, they were medicine, they were survival. In early spring, when the last of the winter stores had shriveled and hope hadn't quite returned to the fields, nettles were often the very first green thing to appear, and they came not gently but fiercely, stinging, burning, claiming their place in the margins. And that sting? It meant they were ready. Boil them once and the sting disappears. Boil them twice and you have a tonic so rich in iron, calcium, vitamin C and magnesium that it could revive the kind of weariness that lives deep in the bones. They were made into stews, teas, poultices. They were mashed into bread dough and layered into pottage. They were fed to the sick, the weary, the expectant mothers whose strength needed bolstering in a world where childbirth could steal a life before the sun set. More than that, they cleansed. Farmers spoke of how nettles cleared the blood, a phrase we'd now translate as detoxification, though their version was somehow more poetic. Nettle tea was poured for aching joints and swollen bellies. Nettle compresses soothed wounds and staved off infection when wounds were cleaned with boiled stream water and hope. You didn't waste nettles, you didn't curse them, you gathered them with care. Gloved hands, sometimes just thick leather sleeves, and you gave thanks, because in the lean months when even dried beans were running low and the hens had stopped laying, a basket of nettles could mean the difference between hunger and just enough. They reminded you that life fights back, even in the cold, even in the dark, even when it stings, and in the medieval world, that was more than enough to earn your respect. The root that waited, burdock beneath the dirt. It doesn't look like much, just another weed at the edge of the garden. Broad, fuzzy leaves with rough undersides, long, tapering stems that cling to your wool with cruel little burrs if you brush too close. Most people walk past it, but the medieval farmer, he digs. Because buried deep beneath those wide, humble leaves is a root, thick, gnarled and strong. That root is burdock, and it's one of the most quietly powerful things to ever grow from neglected soil. Burdock doesn't bloom pretty. It doesn't ask for attention. It just waits, and the longer it waits, the stronger it becomes. In the medieval world, where every bite mattered, burdock was a secret kept by those who lived closest to the earth. The root, once dug up, sometimes a foot long or more, is washed, scrubbed and boiled. What comes out is something earthy and slightly sweet, a flavour that wraps around your ribs and lingers like smoke from a peat fire. But it's not just food, it's function. Burdock purifies the blood, they said, cleans the liver, soothes the skin, eases digestion. And it wasn't just talk. Farmers noticed that those who drank burdock broth in spring, after a long winter of salted meats and no greens, seemed to recover faster. They looked less sallow. They worked longer in the fields before their backs gave out, and their skin, cracked and weathered, began to smooth. They didn't have words like antioxidants or inulin or prebiotic fibre, but they had proof, the kind you only get from seeing someone go from weak to walking, from pale to flushed with life. Burdock was also used in poultices, pounded into mash and laid across wounds or burns. In some villages, midwives used it during birth, feeding it in thin strips to labouring mothers, believing it gave strength. You'd find it wrapped in damp cloth in the corner of a cellar, or hanging in bundles to dry by the hearth. It wasn't a prize crop. It was a lifeline, a root that waited quietly underground until someone with the patience and wisdom to dig it up knew exactly what to do with it. And when the hunger set in, not the kind solved with a loaf of bread, but the kind that asked for something deeper, you reached for burdock, because it wasn't just food, it was fortitude. Field treasures, the protein-packed peasant lentil. If you were poor in the Middle Ages, and odds are you were, you didn't count your wealth in coin. You counted it in sacks of lentils. Tiny, flat and easily overlooked, lentils were the heartbeat of the medieval peasant diet. Not flashy, not sweet, but oh, they filled you, they stayed with you. In a world where meat was rare, fish was fleeting, and bread sometimes more air than grain, lentils were the thing that turned water into a meal. They were easy to grow. They didn't ask much of the land, just a patch of soil and patience. And when they ripened in their brittle little pods, you picked them by hand, cradling the yield like it might vanish in a breeze. In the kitchen, they was everything, mashed into pottage with whatever root scraps remained, boiled with garlic, wild herbs, or nettle if you were lucky, sometimes thickened with barley, other times thinned into a broth to stretch across more bowls. And yes, the monks sang praises of them too. In the fasting seasons, those long stretches when meat was forbidden, lentils were the loophole, a miracle in a brown clay pot, a nod from heaven that said, "You may not feast, but you will not starve." But it wasn't just about staying full. Farmers noticed something else. Those who ate lentils lasted longer. Their muscles didn't fade as fast come winter. They healed quicker. They stayed warmer. Because lentils gave what the body desperately needed but couldn't name: iron, folate, protein. They were like medicine in a meal, with no apothecary needed. You'd find them everywhere, dried and stored in cloth sacks, tucked in the corner of a cool cellar, strung up in garlands to dry above smoky hearths. Some families passed down cooking pots that had only ever known lentil stew. And a good pot, well seasoned with generations of meals, was as treasured as a sword might be in the hands of a knight. They didn't call them superfoods. They didn't need to. They just knew that a bowl of lentils could carry you through hunger, cold, sickness and sorrow. And maybe that's all a superfood needs to be. The green that grows in shade, sorrel's secret bite. Not all saviours in the medieval diet came from the ploughed fields. Some came from the shady edges where trees loom and sunlight stutters. That's where sorrel lives. You wouldn't plant it, you'd stumble upon it. A cluster of sharp green leaves shaped like hearts, hiding beneath hedgerows or between the stones at the edge of a crumbling cottage. Sorrel didn't need an invitation. It grew where it pleased. And when it did, the wise gathered it, because that sour little leaf packed more into its small frame than most plants ever dreamed of. Peasants knew it by taste, a bite like lemon, clean, tart, bright. On a tongue used to dull flavours and bland broths, sorrel was like waking up. In spring it was among the first greens to return after the long grey hush of winter. You'd take the youngest leaves, soft and tender, not yet bitter, and shred them into soups or mash them with grains. They gave the body vitamin C when scurvy began to whisper in the gums. They soothed the belly after months of salted meat and dried root. They stirred the blood, sparked the senses, reminded you that the world still had flavour. And the people noticed. Children who ate sorrel didn't get the gum bleeds. Old ones who added it to their stews walked a little stronger. It fought fatigue, they said, cleansed the bile, set the humours right in the language of the time. But beyond the body, sorrel carried a feeling of spring returning, of green creeping back into the world, of sourness that didn't signal spoil but sharpness, aliveness. You could pickle it too, soak it in brine, stuff it into jars with salt and vinegar, keep it through the leaner months to mix with beans or smear on dark bread. Sorrel was never glamorous. It didn't have the nobility of wheat, or the strength of barley, or the heft of turnips, but it was fierce in its own way. A plant of the edges, uninvited but essential, and in a time when life didn't offer many surprises, biting into a mouthful of sorrel was like remembering what joy felt like, if only for a moment. The milk of the poor, how peasants turned oats into power. No cows, no problem. When your land was too poor for pasture, or the one goat you shared with 3 families had dried up midwinter, you needed something else to fill your bowl. That something was oats. Not the kind in neat cardboard tubes or sweetened with honey, not pressed into bars or blended into smoothies. No, these oats were coarse, rough around the edges, ground by hand between stones or boiled into mush in iron pots scraped thin by years of use. But they were gold. In a medieval world where energy meant survival, oats gave more than they took. They asked only for rain and time. They grew in poor soil where wheat refused to rise. They were patient, forgiving, and loyal. A field of oats was a field of certainty. And that kind of certainty, when the wind could shift your life in a single storm, was rare. You ate them daily, boiled into gruel, yes. Thick, grey, steaming bowls that children grew up on and elders relied on, but also strained and reboiled, mixed with wild herbs, stirred with ground seeds, or thinned with water to make something you might now call oat milk. No one called it that then. It didn't need a name. It was just what you did. You let the oats sit in water until they softened, then mashed and stirred and strained until the mixture turned cloudy and smooth. Not sweet, not creamy, but nourishing. This milk filled bellies when nothing else could. It bound bread doughs when eggs were too precious to spare. It soothed sick stomachs and was fed to children whose teeth hadn't come in yet. It was drinkable, spoonable, usable, and it came from a crop that thrived where even hope struggled. And oats, though plain, were anything but empty. They gave slow energy, just enough to keep you digging, hauling, sowing, carrying, surviving. They had fibre, iron, manganese, even protein. They kept you full. They kept you moving. In a world where food had to work as hard as you did, oats showed up every time. You'd find sacks of them tucked beneath beds or hanging in dry corners of the house. You'd see them boiling over fires before dawn. You'd watch them thicken into shapes you could mould by hand, then bake on hot stones or wrap in cloth to take into the fields. They were plain, they were humble, but they were faithful, and sometimes in the brutal rhythm of medieval life, that was all the nourishment you needed. Earth's hidden pearls, the medieval magic of chickpeas. Imagine the soil cracking open, not in drought but in promise, and from those cracks, pearls small and firm, pale as bone and shaped like a curled fist. Chickpeas. They weren't common everywhere, but where they did grow, usually in the sunburnt corners of southern medieval Europe, they were treasured like relics. For most peasants, meat was something you smelled more often than tasted. If you could see a reflection in a stew, it meant there was nothing in it. But chickpeas, they changed the game. They gave you density, texture, and the bite of something rich, a chew that filled your mouth and slowed your hunger. And when mashed and salted with a bit of garlic or wild onion, they felt almost luxurious, like a meal made for someone with a title. Boiled, roasted, ground into flour, or mashed into paste, chickpeas were as versatile as they were nutritious. They gave strength, not just satisfaction. A bowl of chickpeas at noon could carry you through the long afternoon in the fields. Your arms might ache, your legs might burn, but your belly would be quiet. And in the peasant world, a quiet belly was a rare kind of peace. Chickpeas also had staying power. They stored well, dried hard as pebbles and stashed in clay jars or cloth sacks, sometimes for months at a time. Even through lean winters when rats found their way into almost everything, chickpeas could be counted on to last. Some herbalists even swore they healed. They claimed chickpeas eased kidney pain, helped with digestion, and strengthened the blood. Whether or not that was true, no one doubted they kept you on your feet longer than barley or turnips ever could. You'd see them simmered in stews on fast days, or mixed with oil and vinegar to eat with crusts of rye. In warmer villages they were spiced with wild fennel or stuffed into bread to bake beneath the ashes of a fire. And they tasted better the next day, even better the day after that. They were subtle, sturdy, patient, just like the people who ate them. Chickpeas didn't shout, they didn't dazzle, but they endured. And in a world that punished the weak and hurried the tired, endurance was the closest thing to magic. The leaf that worked over time. Cabbage in every form. In the Middle Ages, you didn't eat for fun. You ate to keep going. And no plant pulled more weight in that endless march of survival than cabbage. It wasn't flashy. It didn't perfume the house like leeks or garlic, but it grew where little else would, and it didn't mind the cold. Even frost couldn't kill it, just made it sweeter. You could see cabbages standing proud in a sea of dead crops, their round, firm heads tucked tightly like secrets. Green, purple or white, they were all some shade of salvation. Boiled, baked, stewed, fermented, cabbage wasn't a dish, it was a way of life. In the heart of winter, when your stores were low and root cellars echoed with emptiness, cabbage remained, hung in bundles from rafters. Packed in barrels with salt, turning into sour, sweet kraut. Eaten raw, shredded thin with vinegar to coax some brightness out of a dim day. It filled soup pots, it filled stomachs, and maybe, more than anything else, it filled the space between starvation and one more day of work. There's a kind of genius in cabbage that modern eyes miss. You could eat the outer leaves young and tender in the spring. You could let the heads mature and slice them into stews. You could save the cores for the pigs or toss them into broths to stretch the flavour. Nothing was wasted. Even the water used to boil it became broth. Thick and slightly sweet, a comfort for sore throats and tired bones. Old herbalists believed cabbage drew out poison. They'd slap poultices of boiled leaves onto wounds and infections. They said it cooled fevers, softened the belly, and restored lost strength. They may have been onto something. Cabbage is rich in vitamins K and C, loaded with fibre, and easy on the gut. In some villages, cabbage grew alongside every other crop, always in shadow, never in the lead, but never absent. It was the worker of the garden, reliable, durable, humble. Even among kings, cabbage found its place. Served boiled at feasts, soaked in butter, or wrapped around minced meats as a poor man's roast. And among peasants, it was love. Not the kind you sing about, the kind you count on. Because cabbage didn't ask for much, and in return, it gave everything. The little pods of power, how broad beans saved lives. They were thick-skinned, hard to chew if you got them wrong. They took a long time to cook and they smelled like earth and iron when they did. But broad beans, sometimes called fava beans, didn't need to charm you. They just had to feed you, and that they did. In the grim years when grain failed or was stolen by taxes, when your rye and barley were gone and your cabbage had frozen in the ground, you turned to these small miracles. Broad beans weren't delicate. They thrived in the cold, stood tall in rough soil, and didn't care much for pampering. And once they came in, tough pods like wrinkled green boots, you had something you could build a meal around. Boiled until soft and mashed with garlic and herbs, they became a peasant's paste. Thick, heavy, and warm enough to settle your hunger for hours. Mixed with grain porridge, they added bulk. Fried in cakes with onions, they tasted almost festive. They were called the meat of the field. Not because they tasted like it, but because they worked like it. Protein-rich, full of fibre and iron, broad beans didn't just fill space. They built muscle. They repaired what frost, famine, or fevers had broken down. You'd eat them in spring, fresh and green, tossed into soups with wild garlic. You'd dry them in the sun for storage, their skins growing leathery, then soak them through long nights so they'd soften by morning. You'd trade them when grain ran low. You'd grind them into flour when even oats became scarce. Old healers swore they strengthened the blood, and some said they soothed anger. Strange perhaps, but not when you think of the power of a full stomach. They had enemies, of course. Nobles often avoided them, calling them poor man's food. But peasants knew better. You'd find them stashed in cloth bags beside root vegetables. You'd see them tucked in the corner of a child's bowl, always the last bite because they were the heaviest. You'd watch strong backs bend in the field, lifting loads made bearable by the quiet power of these little beans. They weren't fun, they weren't light, but they saved you. And sometimes survival doesn't come in the form of sweetness or ease, just in the quiet, brutal generosity of a bean that refuses to quit. The peasant spice, horseradish and the fire that healed. There were no pepper grinders in your cottage, no cinnamon from the east, no saffron threads weighed like gold. But you had fire, and that fire grew in the ground. Horseradish. It didn't look like much. A pale, knobby root, misshapen and muddy, often mistaken for something half-rotten or best left alone. But slice it open, grate it raw, and your eyes would sting, your throat would tighten, your lungs would swear. It was a wild sort of heat, and for peasants who ate the same cold meals day after day, that sting was welcome. Horseradish didn't just flavour food, it reminded you that you were alive, that your tongue could still feel, that your heart still beat in the cold. It was chopped fine and stirred into vinegar to make a sauce sharp enough to cut through the stale bread and dry meat. It went on boiled roots into stews, even mixed with cheese or curds when you were lucky enough to have them. But horseradish was more than flavour. It was medicine, a healer's staple, passed down not through books but through memory. Your grandmother would mash it with lard and rub it onto chests wheezing from winter coughs. A poultice of it could draw out a toothache, or so they believed, and some said it cleansed the blood, awakened the body, burned out the bad humours, and maybe, in its way, it did. Because when you've been cold too long, when your diet is grey and your life is hard, a bite of horseradish can feel like a jolt from the gods. You didn't plant much of it. It grew like a weed. Strong, stubborn, nearly impossible to kill. Dig one up, and 3 more might return next season. And in that way, it was like the people who used it. Rough, enduring, sharp when they needed to be. Horseradish taught you that survival didn't have to be bland, that even in a world of monotony something could shock you awake, and even a root that burned your nose could remind you that you still had one. Hidden in the hedgerows, the healing strength of nettles. You learned early not to touch them bare-handed. The sting taught you. Nettles didn't ask to be picked. They didn't wave in the wind like wheat or beckon from garden beds. They hid in ditches, tangled in hedgerows, shivering with a silent dare. Come closer, but not too close. And yet, peasants went looking for them. Because under that prickly green armour was one of the strongest, most nourishing plants the medieval world had. A superfood dressed as a weed. Once boiled, nettles lost their sting and gave everything else. Iron, calcium, magnesium, vitamins A and C. Nutrients your tired body craved but rarely received. In early spring, when your winter stores were gone and your garden was still a dream, nettles were your first real meal. You'd gather them young, soft and sharp with green life. Gloved hands, quick eyes, and a basket full of pain that became soup. Nettle soup was dark and earthy, thin or thick, depending on what else you had. A boiled potato here, a clove of garlic there, maybe a scrap of leftover grain. It didn't fill you like meat, but it woke you up, brought warmth to your fingers, colour to your cheeks. You didn't just eat them, you wore them. Nettle fibres were stripped and spun like flax to make rough cloth. Itchy, sure, but strong. You washed with them. You fed them to the pigs. You crushed the dried leaves into powders and stirred them into bread. Herbalists called nettles the poor man's blood tonic. They believed nettles healed everything from joint pain to internal bleeding. They used them to cleanse wounds, to warm the body, to clear the spirits. And maybe it worked, because a body aching from the cold and a diet starved of green would feel anything green as a miracle. You didn't always love nettles, but you were grateful for them. They were harsh, they were aggressive, they hurt you before they helped you, but they were always there. And when the snow melted and your hands itched with hunger, nettles were the first thing that said, "It's not over yet. You still have time." The root that fed generations. Why medieval peasants loved parsnips before sugar, before potatoes, before you ever saw a pie. There was the parsnip. And while it might not look like much now, this pale, crooked root once held the power to keep you alive through winter. Not just alive, strong. You grew it in the corner of your field where the soil stayed soft and deep. You let the frost kiss it once or twice, because frost made it sweeter. And then, when most everything else had rotted or vanished, you pulled it up like treasure from the earth. Parsnips were your comfort food before comfort had a name. You roasted them in ash, mashed them with a bit of sour milk, boiled them into porridge with barley and wild herbs. They had body, they had bite, and they had a sweetness that surprised you in a world where sugar didn't exist. They could be sliced thin and dried on racks above the hearth, rehydrated months later in the stew pot, ground into flour, made into cakes with oats and lard. They could mimic meat when none was to be had. You even made honey from parsnips, a thick syrup boiled down and smeared onto stale bread when feasts was just pretend. It wasn't just about taste. Parsnips filled you up. Their dense carbohydrates gave long-lasting energy in the same way meat might, but without the need for coin or slaughter. They kept bellies quiet, and quiet bellies meant better sleep, fewer arguments, and one less worry on already burdened shoulders. Healers favoured them too, used them in tonics for digestion, and as mild cleansers of the blood. They were gentle, meant for the sick, the weak, the children who needed food that didn't fight back. They had no enemies. They offended no gods. No tax collector ever showed up demanding your parsnip harvest. They were invisible in their usefulness, like most peasants. But in that silence they held power, the quiet strength of something that stays. Year after year, frost after frost, meal after meal. If you lived long enough to remember good seasons, parsnips were part of those memories. And if you barely survived the bad ones, they were there too, pulled from frozen ground, scraped clean and boiled until soft. A root that didn't ask for praise, only patience. The green gold of the garden, why medieval peasants prized leeks. Step into any medieval garden and you'd smell them before you saw them. Not sharp like onions, not bitter like wild herbs, but a mellow scent, like something old and wise, warming in a clay pot over coals. Leeks. They didn't brag, they didn't bloom in colour, but no peasant kitchen would have made it through the week without them. Leeks were the quiet foundation of everything. They thickened your soup, spiced your pottage, and gave flavour to bread crusts and boiled roots. They made you feel like a meal was real, not just scraps thrown in water. You planted them in rows along your cabbage and beans, tucked them deep in loamy soil, watered them with care, and watched them grow slowly, tall, proud, green with white shafts like polished stone. They weren't fussy. They held through light frost. They didn't bolt at the first sign of heat. And they came up long after the more delicate herbs had withered. But the real beauty of leeks was what they gave to your body. They were full of iron and vitamin C, two things you desperately needed when your meals ran grey with repetition. They cleared your blood, warmed your chest, helped you breathe easier. Healers mashed them into pastes, pressed them onto wounds, or brewed them into teas for sore throats and fevers. You'd eat them fresh, chopped fine with vinegar, or stewed long with barley and salted fat. A slice of stale bread with leek broth could carry a tired man through an entire day. And on feast days when meat showed up on the fire, leeks weren't left out, they were piled alongside, as rich and wanted as any leg of lamb. Even kings ate them, even monks tended them. But for the peasant, leeks were home. They stood up to hunger, to illness, to the slow grind of a world that gave little and asked for much. And when you woke before dawn, bones aching, breath white in the chill air, a bowl of leek pottage felt like a prayer you could eat. Not flashy, not rare, but faithful. Leeks were the food of people who didn't get to dream big, just dream of enough. The sweet secret of the fields. How medieval farmers used turnips to thrive. They were round and ordinary, too common to be celebrated, too plain to be envied. But turnips were more than filler. To a medieval peasant, they were life insurance in root form. You didn't need rich soil to grow them. They didn't mind the cold. You could sow them in spring and again in late summer, pulling up one harvest as you planted the next. They were dependable in a world where almost nothing else was. Your children grew up on turnips. Your parents died with turnip stew in their bellies. And your own hands, calloused and cracked, spent more hours than you could count digging them out of the half-frozen earth. Boiled, mashed, roasted, grated, turnips could become anything. You'd mash them with butter if you were lucky, or sour milk if you weren't. Thin slices could be fried in a bit of animal fat. Chunks went into every pot, filling space, thickening broth, making every scrap stretch farther. But it wasn't just about eating them. Turnips stored well. You'd bury them in straw, layer them in root cellars, pack them into clay jars. And when the snow came and everything else shriveled, those turnips still waited. Hard, pale, slightly sweet and patient. And they brought more than just calories. Rich in vitamin C, they helped fight off scurvy when winter left nothing fresh. High in fibre and minerals, they kept your gut working when your body slowed in the cold. You fed them to your animals too. You saved the tops for soup greens. Nothing was wasted. Some called them poor man's food. Some turned their noses up at the sight. But you didn't. You saw the turnip for what it was. A humble root that didn't judge your poverty. That didn't wilt when the rain stopped or the frost hit. That showed up on your table again and again, quietly holding your family together. No one toasted with turnips. No one wrote songs about them. But when hunger stared through your door, when the wind howled and your garden slept, you reached for the root that always said, "I'm still here." A taste of summer all year long, the power of dried wild berries. There were days when colour felt like a memory. Grey skies, grey bread, grey moods stitched into every wool tunic. But then, you reached into a small pouch, hidden in a cupboard or under a folded cloth. Inside, tiny wrinkles of red and black, blue and purple, dried wild berries. They tasted like July, even in January. In summer, you'd rise before the sun, walking barefoot through the dewy grass. You knew where the brambles crept near the tree line, those stubborn patches where thorns made you bleed, but the fruit made you forget. Blackberries, raspberries, wild currants. You picked them fast before the birds beat you to them. Not all went into your mouth. Some went onto drying racks, others into cloth bags or pots near the fire, slowly shriveling into chewy, sugar-rich beads of nutrition. They were more than sweet. They were armor. Berries carried antioxidants, though you didn't have a word for that. They warded off illness, strengthened the blood, gave energy to limbs that wanted to sleep all day. In winter, a handful stirred into pottage gave a hint of tart brightness. In spring, soaked in warm water, they became syrup for the weak and the sick. Your grandmother mixed them with honey to soothe sore throats. She chewed them when her joints ached. She crushed them into paste and dabbed them onto cuts. And when your child cried from hunger, a berry tucked into their hand brought you an hour of peace. These weren't fruits of luxury, no vineyards, no imported citrus, just bramble-born sugar, free for the taking, if you braved the thorns and knew where to look. Their presence in your home wasn't guaranteed. A bad season meant the birds got more than you did. A late frost, a missed opportunity, a careless step into a patch of nettles. Any of it could cost you your berry harvest. So when you had them, you guarded them. A few in a bowl during midwinter felt like treasure. Not gold, not jewels, but something deeper. A reminder that joy could be stored if you were wise enough to catch it when it bloomed. Forgotten, fermented, and full of life. How medieval peasants used sauerkraut to survive. If you passed the crooked shed in late autumn, you'd hear it first. That faint bubbling, not from a stream, not from boiling stew, but from barrels. Barrels packed with cabbage and salt. Alive. Sauerkraut. It didn't come with fanfare. No feast songs, no candle-lit blessings. Just layers of shredded cabbage, pressed down with stones, drowned in its own brine and left to rot. Gently, precisely, perfectly. To the medieval peasant, sauerkraut wasn't just food. It was preservation, medicine, and miracle. In the cold, when your body slowed and the world grew lean, fermented cabbage fed you in ways nothing else could. First, it lasted. Sauerkraut kept through the longest winters, tucked in cool corners, tasting sharper with time. You didn't need vinegar. The cabbage made its own sourness, pulling life from salt and air. Second, it healed. You might not have known the word probiotic, but you knew how it felt to eat a bowl of kraut after a month of dry grain and boiled root. It settled the stomach, cleared the skin, lifted the fog in your head. Third, it stretched. A single head of cabbage, salted and stored, fed your family long past harvest. Added to stews, folded into bread, eaten with cold meat or just plain with stale rye. It made whatever else you had go farther. Peasants learned early. Nothing raw survives winter. But fermented things endure. You'd smell the kraut every time you lifted the lid. Acidic, earthy, alive. You'd scoop it with rough fingers, careful not to waste a drop. Some said it kept the plague at bay. Some said it kept you from bleeding out when scurvy turned your gums black. Whether you believed or not, you kept eating. And deep down, you trusted the alchemy. That from rot came strength. From sourness came survival. Sauerkraut wasn't fancy. It wasn't pretty. But it was a shield, brewed in silence, against the emptiness of winter. It was the last breath of summer, whispered through salt and time, and you thanked it with every bite, even if you never said a word. So here we are, 15 forgotten lifelines from a world without fridges, without medicine, without guarantees. Not trendy powders, not exotic imports, just soil-grown grit, preserved, foraged, fermented, and remembered. These weren't foods for luxury. They were foods for survival, for mothers trying to stretch one more bowl of broth, for children who needed one more winter, for hands too tired to lift anything but a wooden spoon, and hearts still strong enough to keep going. Some of these superfoods still exist, quietly tucked into markets, forgotten in seed catalogues, growing wild along hedgerows. Others have been overshadowed, misunderstood, replaced by brighter, shinier things. But if you look closely, that root in the basket, that strange leaf in the field, they're still here, waiting. The wisdom of the medieval farmer wasn't flashy. It was patient, built on repetition, on scraping, saving, and listening to the land. And maybe that's the trick we've forgotten most. Not just what they ate, but how they saw it. Each meal wasn't a routine. It was a choice, a ritual, a quiet act of defiance against hunger, time, and fate. So, if this little journey brought you peace tonight, if the slow rhythm of old survival helped quiet your thoughts, give this video a like. Maybe subscribe if you'd like to walk these old roads again. And tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? Are you in bed, on a walk, driving through the rain? There's something strange and comforting about knowing we're all listening together, separated by miles, connected by story. Wherever you are, whatever's waiting for you tomorrow, rest easy tonight. Because somewhere, in the dark folds of history, someone once made it through a hard season just by boiling a parsnip. And if they could do that, you're going to be just fine.